Hey YouTube, today's project here on the Big Orange will be totally replacing the factory steering column, which was starting to fall apart as soon as I was ready to start using it with this unit I picked up from Motion Raceworks. Two solid tubes, well not solid, but two tubes, both chromoly I believe, strange quick disconnect for the steering wheel, and trial fit up. You can see down here, trial fit up, it ends up looking like I'd have to shorten the D shaft by over half the length, which would put the U-joint at some serious bind angles. So I may want it a little longer than the factory unit was, just to get some more tube clearance on the headers, but it's going to take some cutting, so I thought I'd show you all what it takes to get this thing in here. Okay, first thing is most project cars would go, everything's totally ripped apart, partially disassembled. Big key piece being the seat. So first order of business, I'm going to go ahead and remount the seat I'll be using. So once the steering shaft has been put in place, I can actually get an idea of where I want the steering wheel to be. So if I want to shorten this on both sides, then it'll be cut the support shaft or tube twice, and then the inner tube will be cut last to join up to the U-joint. Alright, with the seat back in and set in a place where I've got plenty of room for all controls, it's time to go ahead and get the steering shaft in next. Alright, before installing the support tube, I'm taking the collar off of the inner tube, which I've already loosened. You can see the marks where it was clamped down pretty well. Sliding it off the end, and then the entire tube just slips right out. Alright, here we have the steering column installed. I have the steering wheel on. You can see it's fairly tight fitting, but spacing wise for me with my seat at the full rear is about dead perfect as far as control goes. So may leave it like this. I may add a couple of spacers on the rear mount points to slightly elevate the front to give me just a few more inches clearance. Other than that, thing fits really well. Well, the quick connect's not going to work well without the shaft locked in the rear, but you get the idea. So now on to test fitting the front to see how things look there. Okay, so I was going to install the spacers for a little more space, so I've laid out what comes with the Motion Raceworks setup. So here's the factory boot. Here's a plate or panel they supply, right, with a new grommet. And this Memorial Day weekend, it feels appropriate that it's made in the USA. And then as far as the parts kit, we have a couple of spacers, washers, lock nuts, and bolts. I'm assuming to replace the factory bolts that are old, rusted, or maybe even missing. But I'll get on to installing these spacers next and show what a difference it makes afterwards. Okay, back with the spacers installed. If I can get a good use those or not. But with those in place, it brings the steering wheel clearance up a substantial amount. So I mean, before I could get like a hand in between here, now there's plenty of extra space. Seat's full rearward at the moment, so I'd probably drive with one notch forward, but everything else setup wise feels almost perfect. Alright, back under the car now. This is where I have it attached to the Flaming River input, to the first U-joint, the D shaft, and the new Borgson U-joint that goes to the smooth shaft. But you can also see how much I'm lacking here space-wise with the tube, so I think I'm going to go back inside the car, try and pull the tube out, make my markings to cut the support tube from inside the car, and then try and get a good final measurement on the inner tube that actually will weld up to this joint. Alright, before I crawled out from under here, I happened to notice that I might be able to get a little more engagement on the input shaft for the steering rack. And it'd be hard to tell in this video, but I got a picture I'll throw in here as well. Looks like maybe I can get another, I don't know, quarter to half inch engagement on the spline section of the shaft. The issue is the shaft has already had a dimple drilled in it for the set screw, so I'll have to pull things apart and take some measurements and see how it turns out, but I'll show that here in a moment. After a little measuring and looking around against the firewall, I decided if I shortened the shaft by at least about an inch, I can probably gain a little more clearance around the header tubes without going over the 30-degree angle I'm trying to stick to for each joint. So here's the cutting of the D shaft. Alright, so comparing the Motion Raceworks tube against the factory mount, right, you can see it's almost a dead even match for the factory column, right up until the tilt mechanism. So you can see about the extra distance that would be covered by the tilt mechanism and the steering wheel mount, but with this kit, with the strange quick release, that takes up that gap. So spacing is almost dead on what it was from the factory. However, on the engine side, you can see how much extra tube there is compared to the factory column. So I'm probably going to end up cutting off 5 to 6 inches here and reinserting the bushing, and then on the actual column itself I will have to probably take off the same amount to have the extra clearance to put the lock ring on and reassemble everything before welding. Alright, so I have everything test fitted before cutting. You can see the tube in the U-joint just at the end without protruding into the space. Here is the amount of free gap that I have at the moment, and this is with the shaft fully resting on the top portion, which I'll show here in a second. So the amount of space I have to clear comes in right at a hair under, or right at 3 inches, almost dead on. So I'm going to cut the tube here, that 3 inches, plus the width of the lock nut to give the extra space to get on there, and then I'll probably add maybe an extra ½ inch just for good measure. Once that's cut, so this has room to come back in towards the bushing, I'm going to retest fit with a full mount to see what the distance is, what the clearance on U-joints is against headers. If everything's good, I will then come to the top end and measure the gap that it creates here, and whatever that gap is should be close to the final cut I need to make for overall clearance. So we'll go try that next. Alright, here's my final cut mark. The lock collar is about a 1/2 inch. I am adding another 1/2 just for extra clearance. So I've got a 4-inch cut line. We'll cut that and then go retest fit. And hopefully we'll be pretty close to making the final cuts, getting everything welded up, put back in. Okay, back from cutting. You can see now the extra length of shaft I have to work with. We've got right at 6.5 inches. That's after adding an extra 1/2 inch in and then losing a 1/4 for the bushing that's in place, which should be more than enough room to allow me to slide this in, find a good fit point, mount it, and then at the top end measure the final cut distance to know how much I need to remove. So time to go get this all back in the car and see how it looks. Alright, you can see I've got this loosely, very loosely, one nut bolted in. Hold it in place to give me a lot of maneuverability while I'm trying to get that last U-joint onto the steering column, or the steering gear. And you can see the extra space that's available to work with. So what I was trying to say a few minutes ago is if everything mounts up and looks clear, steers with no binding, then the point between here and here will be my final cut measurement before a final test fit and welding it up. On the underside of the hood at the moment, you can see it looks like there's going to be plenty of room to maneuver this thing in and get it on that steering shaft. So I'll see what I can to get video from under the car, but this may be one of those where I need both hands free. Alright, this may be a little hard to see, but I managed to get this back on with a little bit of extra threads left to be engaged, but it is about as good as I could get and probably fairly close to where it was when I picked the car up. So everything here looks to be engaged. I snugged down the jam screw, or the set screw, and I'm going to head back up to the top of the car, go ahead and bolt the steering column up to all 4 bolts tightly and see what kind of cutoff space we'll need to make for the final clearance cut. Alright, I think I have the final fit up nearly finished. Let's see if I can get this here, get a good angle on it. Get some better light. So you can see the clearance between the primary is enough to clear. And on the back half, I've actually managed to gain a little clearance over what it had originally. So at this point, it's time to make the final measurement. Measure again, double check, make sure everything's good, and then make the final cut. And then I should be ready to line things up, get everything clocked into position, and weld into place. Okay, my final measurement came in at just about 3 1/16 if you look from the bushing up to the tape measure, but I've got it a little deep in the U-joint for my liking, so I'm going to add an extra 1/16 of an inch to the cut and just call it even 3 1/8. So next step will be to disassemble all of this, pull everything out, and go ahead and make the cut, and then come back and test fit again. Alright, so got the steering shaft back out again. This time I disconnected the whole double D shaft from the steering rack U-joint. You can see where I've marked the lines to keep the steering wheel upright when the wheels are straight ahead. And then I've also center punched both shafts to mark that as well. And when I'm finished, I'm going to go ahead and drill out the U-joint through the shaft even though I intend to weld it just to lock everything up tight for the solid fitment. And if everything's good, I'll just leave the bolt in as a you know, safety measure, I guess, even though I probably won't need it. But now it's time to make the final measurements here and cut. So I'll get started cutting and show you guys what it looks like when it's back together. Alright, quick tip to everybody. Saw this, I think, on Fab Forum's YouTube channel, I believe. There somewhere, but came in very handy today. So since I'm getting ready to cut off my reference points for straight up on the steering shaft, what I've done is put this in a piece of angle, rotate it around. The angle was a little big, so I shimmed it up. Right. Got my marks all set, made some practice marks down here on the end that's going to cut off, and then I just used my center punch to scribe a line along the length of the shaft, well up past where I'll be cutting, to show me the top center. So that way, even after I've cut off my little reference marks I made, I still know where top of the shaft is. So hopefully, you know, somebody else doing this find that useful too. From the outside, you can see I've got everything reinstalled. Thing I may have to make some more clearance for, as you can see in the video here or not, but the D shaft, or the double D shaft, is coming just a bit through that U-joint, and I don't have the set screws in on it, so I may need to go back through and try and realign or loosen things up and get some set screws in and then tighten everything down. Then the top side, everything's in place and looking good, with plenty of clearance, way more than there was before. So I am going to hop in, give it a try, and see how it feels. Okay, back in the car. Plenty of room between legs and steering column. Everything in, locked up. Don't feel any binding at all. And that should be back nearly dead straight ahead. So if everything looks good, when I go check outside again, I think this is about ready to pull and get some final fitment on, get it back in here for good. Alright, after looking this double D shaft thing over, come with a couple possible solutions. Trim the end of the shaft off about 1/8 of an inch, and then re-drill the shaft for the set screws, or possibly add about an 1/8 inch shim to the underside of the steering shaft at the steering wheel side to try and pull that back about 1/8 of an inch. What I am going to do for the moment is go ahead and just take a Sharpie and mark this in there, so when I have the thing removed, it'll be pretty easy to see how much extra clearance I'm going to need. I don't know, probably won't show up in the video, but there's enough mark I can see it. So we'll take that, maybe make a quick trip to the Destroy It Yourself store here in town and see what we can do. So back from the Do-It-Yourself store, where I managed to find 3/4 inch washers in 14 gauge, 16 gauge, and then I just got some grade 8 ones that are a little loose for my liking. But if you look at the marker from earlier, there's so little needed, and I need to trim so little off the end of this that I think I'm just going to go and try shimming it for now. It's be a lot faster and a lot less permanent than making a cut. So for the last fit up here, I'm going to run with this shim, see if that's enough, and if it is, then we should be ready to pull it out for the final time, get everything welded up, and get it back in. I don't know if you'll be able to see or not into the U-joint, but shimming it actually made it worse. I think by shimming it, it pulled the shaft inward enough to change the angle on the double D shaft. So I'm going to go ahead and yank the shims back out and go ahead and shave the end of this double D shaft off by about 1/8 of an inch, and then open up the recesses for the set screws by about 1/8 of an inch as well, and then it should be ready to go back together. So back to the bench with it. Alright, final fitment here is looking really well. And if you can tell, there's still a little bit of the double D shaft that comes through, but nowhere near what it was, and it wasn't binding before. So I think I'm going to go ahead and call this safe. Also going to milled out the hole there a bit for the set screws. So I am going to go ahead and pull this for the final time, get the rear joint Loctited in with the bolts, and go ahead and put a few welds on the rear as well to hold it in place. And I think I'll be ready to put it in for the final time. And I'll show you the setting from inside as well without the fuse panel in place here. Okay, with the fuse panel pulled, so you get better visibility, I've tightened all of the bracket bolts that I could find or access along the firewall and steering shaft. I have everything in solid, have the spacers in. You can see how the clearance is through the firewall opening. So before I weld this up, I'm going to go ahead and put the new firewall block-off plate on and the little rubber bushing that gets riveted on in the end. So here we go, last time out of the car, finally. Have the shaft welded now into the U-joint with a couple of grade 8 3/4 inch 1/4x20 bolts threaded through there and Loctited in. Have the jam nuts and set screws on the double D shaft Loctited in. Went ahead and put the firewall plate and grommet on, so it is ready to go in the car for the last time, and hopefully within 30 minutes this job will be done. Everything's reinstalled. All I have left to finish up is putting in the set screws and Loctiting them, and then yanking the set screw out from the steering rack connection, Loctiting in it and the set screw and putting it back in. And while I had everything apart, I went ahead and took care of grinding off that extra little bit of double D shaft that was sticking through. So you should be able to see that it's no longer protruding out of the center of that U-joint. So at this point it's ready to seal it up, I believe, and call it finished. Alright, everything's back in. Everything works fairly well. Only thing left to do is to bolt in the little floor plate, the firewall, then rivet down the grommet that goes over that, and then it's back to finishing up the wiring loom, and pretty close to back on the road. I think all that's left now is getting the wipers fully functional and finishing wiring up the new headlight and turn signal harness on the front, and then we'll be ready to go. Hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions about how I did the work I did, or if you're looking at getting one of these, it's involved, but it's not hard. Thanks.